a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Ultimate Fighting Championship. The Ultimate Fighting Championship is an American mixed martial arts promotion company based in Las Vegas, Nevada, that is owned and operated by parent company William Morris Endeavor. It is the largest MMA promotion company in the world and features the highest level fighters on the roster. The UFC produces events worldwide that showcase 12 weight divisions and abide by the unified rules of mixed martial arts. As of 2018, the UFC has held over 400 events. Dana White serves as the president of the UFC. White has held that position since 2001, while under his stewardship, the UFC has grown into a globally popular multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The first event was held in 1993 at the McNichols Sports Arena in Denver, Colorado. The purpose of the early Ultimate Fighting Championship competitions was to identify the most effective martial art in a contest with minimal rules between competitors of different fighting disciplines like boxing, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, sambo, wrestling, Muay Thai, karate, and judo. In subsequent events, fighters began adopting effective techniques from more than one discipline, which indirectly helped create an entirely separate style of fighting known as present-day mixed martial arts. In 2016, UFC's parent company, Zuffa, was sold to a group led by William Morris Endeavor for $4.2 billion. With a TV deal and expansion in Australia, Asia, Europe and new markets within the United States, the UFC has increased in popularity and has achieved greater mainstream media coverage. The promotion brought in a total revenue of $609 million in 2015, and its next domestic media rights agreement with ESPN was valued at $1.5 billion over a 5-year term. Early competition, early 1990s. Art Davie proposed to John Milius and Rorion Gracie an 8-man single elimination tournament called War of the Worlds. The tournament was inspired by the Gracies in Action video series produced by the Gracie family of Brazil, which featured Gracie jiu-jitsu students defeating martial arts masters of various disciplines such as karate, kung fu, and kickboxing. The tournament would also feature martial artists from different disciplines facing each other in no-holds-barred combat to determine the best martial art, and would aim to replicate the excitement of the matches Davie saw on the videos. Milius, a noted film director and screenwriter, as well as a Gracie student, agreed to act as the event's creative director. Davie drafted the business plan and 28 investors contributed the initial capital to start WOW Promotions with the intent to develop the tournament into a television franchise. In 1993, WOW Promotions sought a television partner and approached pay-per-view producers TVKO and SET, as well as Campbell McLaren and David Isaacs at the Semaphore Entertainment Group. Both TVKO and SET declined. But SEG, a pioneer in pay-per-view television which had produced such offbeat events as a gender versus gender tennis match between Jimmy Connors and Martina Navratilova, became WOW's partner in May 1993. SEG contacted video and film art director Jason Cusson to design the trademarked Octagon, a signature piece for the event. Cusson remained the production designer through UFC 27. SEG devised the name for the show as the Ultimate Fighting Championship. WOW Promotions and SEG produced the first event, later called UFC 1, at McNichols Sports Arena in Denver, Colorado on November 12, 1993. Art Davie functioned as the show's booker and matchmaker. The show proposed to find an answer for sports fans' questions such as, can a wrestler beat a boxer? As with most martial arts at the time, fighters typically had skills in just one discipline and had little experience against opponents with different skills. The television broadcast featured kickboxers Patrick Smith and Kevin Rosier, savate fighter Gerard Gordeau, karate expert Zane Fraser, shoot fighter Ken Shamrock, sumo wrestler Tila Tuli, boxer Art Jimison, and 175 pounds Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt Royce Gracie, younger brother of UFC co-founder Rorion, whom Rorion handpicked to represent his family in the competition. Royce Gracie's submission skills proved the most effective in the inaugural tournament, earning him the first ever UFC tournament championship after submitting Jimison, Shamrock, and Gordeau in succession. The show proved extremely successful with 86,592 television subscribers on pay-per-view. It's disputed whether the promoters intended for the event to become a precursor to a series of future events. That show was only supposed to be a one-off. Eventual UFC president Dana White said, "It did so well on pay-per-view they decided to do another, and another. Never in a million years did these guys think they were creating a sport." Art Davey, in his 2014 book Is This Legal? An account of the creation of the first UFC event, disputes the perception that the UFC was seen by WOW Promotions and SEG as a one-off, since SEG offered a 5-year joint development deal to WOW. He says, "Clearly, both Campbell and Meowitz shared my unwavering belief that War of the Worlds would be a continuing series of fighting tournaments, a franchise, rather than a one-night stand. With no weight classes, fighters often faced significantly larger or taller opponents. Keith, the Giant Killer, Hackney faced Emmanuel Yarbrough at UFC 3 with a 9 in height and 400 pounds weight disadvantage. Many martial artists believed that technique could overcome these size disadvantages, and that a skilled fighter could use an opponent's size and strength against him, with the 175-pound Royce Gracie winning 3 of the first 4 events. The UFC quickly proved that size does not always determine the outcome of the fight. During this early part of the organization, the UFC would showcase a bevy of different styles and fighters. Aside from the aforementioned Royce Gracie, Ken Shamrock, and Patrick Smith, the competitions also featured competitors such as Hall of Famer Dan Severn, Marco Ruiz, Gary Goodridge, Don Fry, Kimo Leopoldo, Oleg Toktarov, and Tank Abbott. Although the first events were dominated by jiu-jitsu, other fighting styles became successful, first wrestling, then ground and pound, kickboxing, boxing, and dirty boxing, which eventually melded into modern mixed martial arts. In April 1995, following UFC 5 in Charlotte, North Carolina, Davey and Gracie sold their interest in the franchise to SEG, and disbanded WOW Promotions. Davey continued with SEG as the show's booker and matchmaker, as well as the commissioner of Ultimate Fighting, until December 1997. Emergence of stricter rules. Although UFC used the tagline, "There are no rules," in the early 1990s, the UFC did in fact operate with limited rules. It banned biting and eye gouging, and allowed techniques such as hair pulling, headbutting, groin strikes, and fish hooking. In a UFC 4 qualifying match, competitors Jason Fenn and Guy Mesger agreed not to pull hair, as they both wore ponytails tied back for the match. That same event saw a matchup between Keith Hackney and Joe Sun, in which Hackney unleashed a series of groin shots against Sun while on the ground. The UFC had a reputation, especially in the early days, as an extremely violent event, as evidenced by a disclaimer in the beginning of the UFC 5 broadcast which warned audiences of the violent nature of the sport. UFC 5 also introduced the first singles match, a rematch from the inaugural UFC featuring 3-time champion Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock, called the Super Fight. This proved an important development, because singles matches would feature fighters who suffered no prior damage from a previous fight in the same event, unlike tournament matches. Singles matches would become a staple in the UFC for years to come. The Super Fight began as a non-tournament match that would determine the first reigning UFC champion for tournament winners to face. It later evolved into a match that could feature either title matches or non-title matches. The Super Fight would eventually completely phase out tournament matches. By UFC Brazil, the UFC abandoned the tournament format for an entire card of singles matches. UFC 6 was the first event to feature the crowning of the first non-tournament UFC champion, Ken Shamrock. Controversy and reform, late 1990s. The violent nature of the burgeoning sport quickly drew the attention of the U.S. authorities. In 1996, Senator John McCain saw a tape of the first UFC events and immediately found it abhorrent. McCain himself led a campaign to ban UFC, calling it human cockfighting, even sending letters to the governors of all 50 U.S. states asking them to ban the event. 36 states enacted laws that banned no-hold-barred fighting, including New York, which enacted the ban on the eve of UFC 12. forcing a relocation of the event to Dothan, Alabama. The UFC continued to air on DirecTV PPV, though its audience remained minuscule compared to the larger cable pay-per-view platforms of the era. In response to the criticism, the UFC increased cooperation with state athletic commissions and redesigned its rules to remove the less palatable elements of fights while retaining the core elements of striking and grappling. UFC 12 saw the introduction of weight classes and the banning of fish hooking. For UFC 14, gloves became mandatory, while kicks to the head of a downed opponent were banned. UFC 15 saw limitations on hair pulling, and the banning of strikes to the back of the neck and head, headbutting, small joint manipulations, and groin strikes, with 5-minute rounds introduced at UFC 21. The UFC gradually rebranded itself as a sport rather than a spectacle. Led by UFC Commissioner Jeff Blatnick and referee John McCarthy, the UFC continued to work with state athletic commissions. Blatnick, McCarthy, and matchmaker Joe Silva created a manual of policies, procedures, codes of conduct, and rules to help in getting the UFC sanctioned by the athletic commissions, many of which exist to this day. Blatnick and McCarthy traveled around the country, educating regulators and changing perceptions about a sport that was thought to be bloodthirsty and inhumane. By April 2000, their movement had clearly made an impact. California was set to become the first state in the U.S. to sign off on a set of codified rules that governed MMA. Soon after, New Jersey adopted the language. As the UFC continued to work with the athletic commissions, events took place in smaller U.S. markets and venues, such as the Lake Charles Civic Center. The markets included states that are largely rural and less known for holding professional sporting events, such as Iowa, Mississippi, Louisiana, Wyoming, and Alabama. SEG could not secure home video releases for UFC 23 through UFC 29, with other mixed martial arts promotions working towards U.S. sanctioning. The International Fighting Championships secured the first U.S.-sanctioned mixed martial arts event, which occurred in New Jersey on September 30, 2000. Just 2 months later, the UFC held its first sanctioned event, UFC 28, under the New Jersey State Athletic Control Board's unified rules. As the UFC's rules started to evolve, so too did its field of competitors. Notable UFC fighters to emerge in this era include Hall of Famers Mark Coleman, Randy Couture, Pat Miletic, Chuck Liddell, Matt Hughes, and Tito Ortiz, as well as notables Vitor Belfort, Mark Kerr, Pedro Rizzo, Milo Bustamante, Frank Shamrock, Mikey Burnett, Jeremy Horn, Pete Williams, Jens Pulver, Evan Tanner, Andrei Arlovsky, and Vanderlei Silva, among others. Zuffa era, early 2000s. After the long battle to secure sanctioning, SEG stood on the brink of bankruptcy, when Station Casino's executives Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta and their business partner Dana White approached them in 2000, with an offer to purchase the UFC. A month later, in January 2001, the Fertittas bought the UFC for $2 million and created Zuffa LLC as the parent entity controlling the UFC. I had my attorneys tell me that I was crazy, because I wasn't buying anything. I was paying $2 million and they were saying, "What are you getting?" Lorenzo Fertitta revealed to Fighters Only magazine, recalling the lack of assets he acquired in the purchase. And I said, "What you don't understand is I'm getting the most valuable thing that I could possibly have, which is those 3 letters, UFC. That is what's going to make this thing work. Everybody knows that brand. Whether they like it or they don't like it, they react to it." With ties to the Nevada State Athletic Commission, Zuffa secured sanctioning in Nevada in 2001. Shortly thereafter, the UFC returned to pay-per-view cable television with UFC 33 featuring 3 championship bouts. Struggle for survival and turnaround. The UFC slowly, but steadily, rose in popularity after the Zuffa purchase, due partly to greater advertising, corporate sponsorship, the return to cable pay-per-view and subsequent home video and DVD releases, with larger live gates at casino venues like the Trump Taj Mahal and the Emergence Grand Garden Arena. The UFC secured its first television deal with Fox Sports Net. The Best Damn Sports Show period aired the first mixed martial arts match on American cable television in June 2002, as well as the main event showcasing Chuck Liddell vs. Vitor Belfort at UFC 37.5. Later, FSN would air highlight shows from the UFC, featuring one-hour blocks of the UFC's greatest bouts. UFC 40 proved to be the most critical event to date in the Zuffa era. The event was a near sellout of 13,022 at the Emergence Grand Arena and sold 150,000 pay-per-view buys, a rate roughly double that of the previous Zuffa events. The event featured a card headlined by a highly anticipated championship grudge match between then current UFC light heavyweight champion Tito Ortiz and former UFC superfight champion Ken Shamrock, who had previously left professional wrestling in the WWE before returning to MMA. It was the first time the UFC hit such a high mark since being forced underground in 1997. UFC 40 also garnered mainstream attention from massive media outlets such as ESPN and USA Today, something that was unfathomable for mixed martial arts at that point in time. Many have suggested that the success of UFC 40 and the anticipation for Ortiz vs. Shamrock saved the UFC from bankruptcy. The buy rates of the previous Zuffa shows averaged a mere 45,000 buys per event, and the company was suffering deep monetary losses. The success of UFC 40 provided a glimmer of hope for the UFC and kept alive the hope that mixed martial arts could become big. Beyond the rivalry itself, the success of UFC 40 was due in part to the marketing and outreach power of crossover athletes from pro wrestling to MMA and MMA to pro wrestling, a practice with roots in Japan's Pride Fighting Championships. Longtime UFC referee, Big John McCarthy said that he felt UFC 40 was the turning point in whether or not the sport of MMA would survive in America. Despite the success of UFC 40, the UFC was still experiencing financial deficits. By 2004, Zuffa had $34 million of losses since they purchased the UFC. Fighters who came into prominence after Zuffa's takeover include Anderson Silva, Georges St. Pierre, Rich Franklin, BJ Penn, Sean Sherk, Matt Serra, Rico Rodriguez, Robbie Lawler, Frank Mir, Caro Parisian, and Nick Diaz. The Ultimate Fighter and rise in popularity. Faced with the prospect of folding, the UFC stepped outside the bounds of pay-per-view and made a foray into television. After being featured in a reality television series, American Casino, and seeing how well the series worked as a promotion vehicle, the Fertitta brothers developed the idea of the UFC having its own reality series. Their idea, The Ultimate Fighter, was a reality television show featuring up-and-coming MMA fighters in competition for a six-figure UFC contract, with fighters eliminated from competition via exhibition mixed martial arts matches. It was pitched to several networks, each one rejecting the idea outright. Not until they approached Spike TV, with an offer to pay the $10 million production costs themselves, did they find an outlet. In January 2005, Spike TV launched The Ultimate Fighter 1 in the time slot following WWE Raw. The show became an instant success, culminating with a notable season finale brawl featuring light heavyweight finalists Forrest Griffin and Stefan Bonner going toe-to-toe for the right to earn the six-figure contract. The live broadcast of the season finale drew a very impressive 1.9 overall rating. Dana White credits Tough One for saving the UFC. On the heels of the Griffin/Bonner finale, a second season of The Ultimate Fighter launched in August 2005, and two more seasons appeared in 2006. Spike and the UFC continued to create and air new seasons until the show moved to FX in 2012. Following the success of The Ultimate Fighter, Spike also picked up UFC Unleashed, an hour-long weekly show featuring select fights from previous events. Spike also signed on to broadcast live UFC Fight Night, a series of fight events debuting in August 2005, and countdown specials to promote upcoming UFC pay-per-view cards. After a very successful run on Spike, and with the upcoming announcement of the UFC's new relationship with Fox, Spike officials made a statement regarding the end of their partnership with the UFC. The Ultimate Fighter Season 14 in September will be our last. Our 6-year partnership with the UFC has been incredibly beneficial in building both our brands, and we wish them all the best in the future. With the announcement of UFC's partnership with Fox in August 2011, The Ultimate Fighter, which entered its 14th season in that September, moved to the FX network to air on Friday nights starting with season 15 in the spring of 2012. Along with the network change, episodes are now edited and broadcast within a week of recording instead of a several-month delay, and elimination fights are aired live. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?